The Valkyrie Empire had mourned Princess Sirith for 3 long solar cycles. And across 1,000 worlds, her name was spoken only in whispers of sorrow and loss. For she had been the hope of an ancient civilization, the only heir to a throne that had stood for 10,000 years, and now she was gone, swallowed by the endless darkness of the barren expanse where no ship had ever returned and no signal had ever escaped. Queen Aleph had buried an empty tomb beneath the crystal spire of her ancestors, and she had sealed her 4 hearts against hope, because hope was a poison that killed slowly, and she was too old and too wise to drink from that cup again. So she ruled her empire with cold efficiency and waited for death to reunite her with her daughter. But death had other plans, and so did fate. And so did a human mechanic named Cole Bennett, who lived on a small colony world at the edge of known space new. Montana was not an important world by any measure that mattered to the great powers of the galaxy, for it was simply a farming colony where humans grew wheat and corn and raised cattle under an orange sun. And the people there lived simple lives far removed from the politics and wars that shaped the destinies of empires. And Cole Bennett was perhaps the simplest of them all. He was 32 years old, with brown hair that was always messy and hands that were always covered in grease and oil. And he lived alone in a small farmhouse that he had built himself from salvaged materials and stubborn determination. And his only companions were his machines, which he talked to as if they could answer back, calling them by names and asking their opinions on matters both important and trivial. Cole had not always been a mechanic on a backwater farming world. For once he had been a soldier in the Colonial Defense Force, and he had fought in 3 separate conflicts, and earned a Medal of Valor that now sat in a drawer he never opened, because the memories attached to it were too heavy to carry, and too precious to throw away. The night the escape pod fell from the sky was a night like any other at first, with summer storms rolling across the wheat fields and lightning painting the clouds in shades of purple and white. And Cole sat on his porch drinking coffee and watching the show because there was nothing on the colony network worth watching, and the storms were free. He saw the streak of fire cut across the sky, and knew immediately that it was not lightning and not a meteor, but something else entirely. Something that was trying very hard not to die. And when it crashed into his north field with a sound like thunder and fury combined, he grabbed his emergency kit and ran toward the smoke without hesitation, because that was simply who he was. The pod was half buried in the earth and still hot to the touch, and strange symbols glowed along its surface in a language Cole had never seen. And when he found the release mechanism and forced the hatch open, the being inside made him take 3 steps backward in pure shock. She was not human. That much was certain and obvious and undeniable, for her skin was the color of lavender flowers in spring, and her blood was silver where it leaked from a wound on her forehead. And her eyes had 4 pupils each that tracked his movements with a mixture of fear and defiance and pain. And she was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Cole Bennett had ever seen in all his 32 years of life. She spoke words he could not understand in a voice like wind chimes and distant bells. And he spoke words she could not understand in his plain farmer accent. And for a long moment, they simply stared at each other across a gulf of evolution and culture, and time that should have been impossible to bridge. But Cole had learned long ago that impossible was just a pill, but Cole had learned long ago that impossible was just a word people used when they had given up. So he smiled and held out his hand and pointed toward his farmhouse and mimed the act of drinking water and eating food. And the alien woman with lavender skin and silver blood understood enough to nod weakly and accept his help. He carried her across his field because she could not walk, and she weighed almost nothing in his arms, and her 4-pupiled eyes never left his face, as if She was trying to understand what kind of creature would help a stranger. Without asking anything in return, Cole gave her water and bandaged her wounds with supplies from his emergency kit. And he made her soup, because soup was what his mother had always made when someone was sick or hurt. And the alien woman ate it slowly and carefully, and seemed surprised that it did not poison her. 3 days passed in this way, with Cole caring for his strange guest and trying to communicate through drawings and gestures and the universal language of kindness. And he learned that her name was Sirith, though he did not yet know what that name meant to a billion souls across the galaxy on the 4th day. The raiders came. Cole heard them before he saw them. The whine of atmospheric engines cutting through the morning air. And he looked up to see 3 ships descending toward his farm with weapons already charging. And he knew in his gut that they were not here to help. Sirith made a sound of pure terror when she saw the ships. And she grabbed Cole's arm with surprising strength, and her 4 pupils dilated with fear. And even though they could not speak the same language, he understood perfectly what she was trying to tell him. Run. She was saying, run and save yourself, because they are here for me, and they will kill anyone who stands in their way. But Cole Bennett had never been very good at running, and he was even worse at leaving people behind. So instead of fleeing, he walked to his storage shed and retrieved his hunting rifle and his cutting torch, and the combat training that he had tried so hard to forget. The Kethvorn slavers landed in his wheat field with the confidence of predators who had never met serious resistance, for they were large and heavily armed, and they numbered 12. And they had tracked the escape pod signal across 3 systems, because the cargo inside was worth more than entire planets. They did not expect the human Cole killed the first one before they even knew he was there. A clean shot through what he hoped was a vital organ. And then everything became chaos and fire, and the kind of desperate violence that he had hoped to never experience again. He killed 7 of them in total before the rest fled back to their ships. And he took 3 plasma burns doing it. 1 on his shoulder, and 1 on his thigh, and 1 across his ribs that would leave a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. And when it was over, he collapsed on his porch and laughed because he was alive, and she was safe, and nothing else. Moderate Sirith knelt beside him with silver tears streaming down her lavender face, and she touched his wounds with gentle hands and spoke words he could not understand. But her meaning was clear in every gesture and every glance. Why? She was asking, why did you fight? For me, when you do not even know who I am. Cole looked up at her with blood soaking through his shirt and pain radiating through his body, and smiled the same simple smile he had offered her on the first night. Because you needed help, he said, knowing she could not understand the words, but hoping she could understand the feeling behind them. And I was here. It took 3 more weeks for her translator implant to be repaired enough for real communication. And in that time, Cole learned to read her expressions, and she learned to read his. And a bond formed between them that transcended language and species and everything that should have kept them apart when she finally told him who she really was. The daughter of an empress who ruled 1,000 worlds. The heir to an empire older than human civilization. Cole simply nodded and asked if she wanted more soup. She had never met anyone who cared so little about her title and so much about whether she had eaten. And in that moment, Princess Sirith of the Volcari Empire began to understand that humans were something special and strange and wonderful, and that this one human in particular had changed her life forever. The Volcari diplomatic fleet arrived above New Montana like a constellation of stars descending from the heavens. 12 massive vessels that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built, each one adorned with the golden symbols of the imperial house and bristling with weapons that could reduce cities to ash. The colony's governor sent frantic messages to Earth requesting guidance. But Earth was months away by conventional communication, and the fleet was here now. Hanging in orbit like a judgment waiting to be delivered, Cole stood on his porch and watched the ships through a pair of old binoculars. And he whistled low and long because he had seen warships before during his military service, but nothing like this. Nothing that radiated power and age and absolute authority in quite the same way. "Your mom does not mess around," he said to Cirith, who was standing beside him in borrowed human clothes that did not quite fit right. "She is the queen of 1,000 worlds." Cirith replied, "She does not know how to do anything small." The transport shuttle descended 2 hours later, cutting through the atmosphere with perfect precision and landing in Cole's wheat field with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so large. And when the ramp lowered and the honor guard emerged, Cole felt his breath catch in his throat. There were 200 soldiers in armor that gleamed like polished silver, each one carrying weapons and moving with the fluid grace of warriors who had trained for centuries. And they formed perfect lines on either side of the ramp and stood at attention like statues carved from discipline and devotion. And then Queen Aleph descended, and Cole understood for the first time what it meant to stand in the presence of true power. She was tall even by Volcari standards, her lavender skin deeper in color than her daughter's, and her eyes held the weight of 800 years of life and 300 years of rule. And she moved with a grace that made every step seem like a dance and every gesture seem like a commander. Gown was made of materials that shifted color as she walked, flowing from deep purple to brilliant gold to soft silver, and a crown of living crystal sat upon her head, its facets catching the light and scattering it into rainbows that danced across the trampled wheat. She was ancient and beautiful and terrifying. And Cole found himself standing up straighter without consciously deciding to do so. Cirith walked forward to meet her mother, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. The queen who had buried an empty tomb, and the daughter who had returned from the dead. And then Aleph opened her arms, and Cirith rushed into them, and they embraced while silver tears streamed down both their faces. Cole watched this reunion from his porch with his hands in his pockets, feeling like an intruder on something sacred and private. And he was thinking about quietly going inside to make coffee when the queen's eyes found him. "You," she said, and her voice carried across the field without effort, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "You are the one who saved my daughter." It was not a question. And Cole recognized the tone of someone who already knew the answers and was simply testing to see if he would lie. "She saved herself mostly," he replied, walking down from his porch to meet her because hiding felt wrong and disrespectful. "I just handled the parts she could not reach." The guards bristled at his casual tone, hands moving toward weapons, but Aleph raised one elegant hand and they froze instantly. 200 warriors stopped by a single gesture. The queen studied him with those ancient eyes, taking in his stained clothes and messy hair, and the scars that were visible on his arms and neck. And Cole felt like he was being read like a book by someone who had memorized every story ever written. "The Kethvoran raiders you killed," she said finally. "Their clan has demanded blood payment. They claim you murdered their warriors without provocation." Cole had expected something like this, because raiders and slavers were the same everywhere. Quick to attack and quicker to cry victim when they lost, and he felt a cold anger rise in his chest at the accusation. "They came to take her," he said, his voice steady and certain. "I stopped them. If that is murder, then I guess I am a murderer." Cirith made a small sound of distress, but Elith's expression did not change, and Cole realized she was testing him again, pushing to see what he was made of. "The penalty for killing 7 Kethvoran warriors is death by slow consumption," the queen continued. "They will eat you alive over the course of several days. It is a tradition among their kind, a way of absorbing the strength of their enemies." Cole felt fear then, real genuine fear, because dying was one thing, but being eaten alive was something else entirely, something that made his stomach turn and his skin crawl. but he had learned long ago that showing fear was often more dangerous than feeling it. So he kept his voice steady and his shoulders straight. "Then I hope they brought antacids," he said, "because I plan to give them indigestion." There was a moment of absolute silence. And then Queen Aleph laughed, a sound like silver bells ringing in a summer wind. And her guards looked at each other in confusion, because they had never heard their queen laugh at the words of a prisoner or a guest, or anyone at all in living memory. "You are either very brave or very foolish," she said, "and I suspect you are both in equal measure." Cirrus stepped forward then, her chin raised and her voice carrying the authority of her birthright. And she spoke words that made the guards gasp and the queen's eyes narrow. "He is under my protection," the princess declared. "Any claim against him is a claim against the crown, and I will answer any challenge with the full force of imperial law." The silence that followed stretched across the field like a held breath, and Cole watched the battle of wills between mother and daughter with the feeling that he was standing in the middle of something much larger than himself. Aleph studied her daughter for a long moment, seeing the changes that 3 years of presumed death and weeks of survival had wrought, seeing the strength that had always been there, but was now tempered and sharpened by experience. "You have changed," the queen said quietly. "The daughter I lost would never have spoken to me thus. She would never have claimed protection over an alien. She would never have defied tradition and expectation." Cirrus did not flinch or look away, and her voice was soft but certain when she replied, "The daughter you lost died in the barren expanse. The woman who stands before you was reborn in a wheat field on a human colony world, and she was taught by a man who does not understand the meaning of surrender, that some traditions deserve to be defied." Cole felt his face flush at being talked about like he was not standing right there, but he kept his mouth shut, because this was clearly a conversation that did not need his input. Queen Aleph was silent for what felt like an eternity, her ancient eyes moving between her daughter and the human who had saved her, and when she finally spoke, her voice held something it had not held before, something that might have been respect. "Very well," she said. "The human will come with us to the homeworld. His fate will be decided by the imperial court according to law and tradition, and you will stand as his advocate if that is your wish." Cirrus relaxed slightly, the tension flowing out of her shoulders, and she nodded in acknowledgement of her mother's decision. "Thank you," she said, and the queen waved away the gratitude like it was an annoying insect. "Do not thank me yet," Aleph replied. "The court is full of those who would use this situation against you, against our house, against any connection with the younger races. The human may have survived raiders, but surviving politics is an entirely different challenge." She turned and began walking back toward her shuttle, her guards falling into formation around her. And she paused at the ramp and looked back at Cole with an expression he could not read. "Bring nothing you cannot carry," she said, "and say goodbye to your world, human, because you are about to enter mine." Cole looked around at his farm, at the wheat fields he had planted, and the house he had built, and the life he had created from nothing after the wars had taken everything. And he felt a strange mixture of grief and excitement that he did not have words to describe. But Cirrus was watching him with hope and fear in her four-pupiled eyes, and he realized that she was afraid he would refuse, afraid he would choose his safe small life over the unknown dangers that waited among the stars. So he smiled and shrugged and walked toward the shuttle without looking back. "I never liked farming anyway," he said, and Cirrus laughed and took his hand and led him into a future neither of them could predict. The weeks that followed the raider attack were filled with healing and learning and the slow building of understanding between two beings who should have had nothing in common but somehow had everything that mattered. Cole's wounds closed slowly because human bodies were fragile things that took their time with recovery, and Cirrus watched this process with a mixture of fascination and concern because her own species healed much faster, and she could not understand how humans survived at all when they were so easily broken. She helped him change his bandages, even though the sight of red human blood made her stomach turn. And she learned to cook simple human food because he had fed her when she was helpless, and she wanted to return the kindness. And her first attempts were disasters that made Cole laugh so hard he reopened the wound on his ribs. But she kept trying because that was what he had taught her without words. That failure was not an ending but simply a step on the path to success. And eventually, she could make soup that was almost edible and coffee that was only slightly terrible. The translator implant in Sirith's head had been damaged in the crash. Its delicate circuits scrambled by the violence of her escape from the celestial dawn. And without it, she could only speak the musical language of her people, which no human had ever learned. Cole spent hours in his workshop, studying the damaged technology with the same patient attention. He gave the broken tractors and malfunctioning harvesters. And piece by piece, he figured out how it worked and what it needed to function again. Your people have been traveling between stars for 10,000 years, he said one evening while soldering a connection that was smaller than a grain of rice. And you still use the same basic circuit principles we figured out 2 centuries ago. That is both comforting and slightly disappointing. Sirith did not understand his words, but she understood his tone. The gentle teasing that had become their primary form of communication. And she made a rude gesture that she had learned from watching him interact with his machines. When they refused to cooperate, when the translator finally flickered back to life. The first words Sirith spoke in English were "thank you," and the second words were "I am sorry." And Cole told her she had nothing to apologize for, because she had not asked the raiders to come, and she had not asked him to fight. "But you were hurt because of me," she said. And her voice in English was strange and beautiful, like someone had taught wind chimes to form words. "I have been hurt before," Cole replied while cleaning his tools. "I will probably be hurt again. That is just how life works when you are made of meat and stubbornness." Sirith stared at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. And it was the first time she had laughed since before her ship was sabotaged and her entire escort was murdered and her life became a nightmare of survival and fear. She told him everything over the following days, the story pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. And Cole listened without interruption, because listening was a skill he had learned long ago, and it was often more valuable than speaking. The Celestial Dawn had been her personal diplomatic vessel, a ship designed for comfort and negotiation rather than combat. And she had been traveling to a summit meeting with 3 other spacefaring species when the sabotage occurred. The explosion had been perfectly timed and perfectly placed, destroying the engine core in a way that looked like an accident but could only have been deliberate. And everyone aboard had died except for Sirith herself, and that was only because her personal guard, a warrior named Keth, who had served her family for 200 years, had thrown her into an escape pod and sealed the door before the fire consumed him. "He saved my life," Sirith said quietly. "And I never even got to thank him. I never got to tell him that he was more than a guard to me. He was family." Cole understood that kind of loss because he carried similar weights in his own heart. And he reached out and took her hand and held it gently. And no words were necessary, because some things transcended language entirely. The investigation into the sabotage had never been completed because there was no wreckage to examine. The barren expanse had swallowed everything. And the official verdict was tragic accident, which Sirith knew was a lie but could not prove. "Someone in the Empire wanted me dead," she said. "Someone powerful enough to reach my ship and bribe or threaten my crew. And they are still out there, still hiding behind their lies and their power." Cole thought about this for a while, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle that needed solving. And then he asked the question that seemed most important. "What do you want to do about it?" Sirith had expected sympathy or outrage or promises of vengeance. But she had not expected this simple practical question, and it forced her to actually think about what she wanted, rather than simply reacting to what had happened. "I want to go home," she said finally. "I want to see my mother and tell her I am alive. And I want to find the people who killed my friends and make them answer for their crimes." Cole nodded, as if she had said the most reasonable thing in the world, and then stood up and walked to his workshop and began gathering tools and components that she did not recognize. "Then we need to build a transmitter strong enough to reach your homeworld," he said over his shoulder. "Because I am guessing that little pod of yours did not come equipped with long-range communications." He was right. Of course, the escape pod had been designed for short-term survival rather than interstellar messaging, and its weak signal had only attracted the raiders who had been hunting in nearby systems. Building the transmitter took 2 more weeks of constant work, with Cole scavenging parts from every piece of technology on his farm, and Sirith providing technical knowledge that her translator struggled to convert into English. They argued sometimes, because they were both stubborn and certain they were right. And they laughed sometimes because the absurdity of their situation was impossible to ignore. And somewhere in between the arguments and the laughter, something deeper began to grow. Sirith found herself watching Cole when he was not looking, studying the way he moved and spoke and existed in the world. And she realized that she had never met anyone quite like him in all her 140 years of life. He was not handsome by Velkari standards, his features too soft and his skin too pale. But there was something in his eyes that drew her attention again and again. A quiet strength that did not need to announce itself because it simply was. Cole found himself thinking about Sirith at odd moments, wondering what she was doing and whether she was comfortable and if she needed anything. And these thoughts confused him because he had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to care about another person. When the transmitter was finally complete, they carried it to the highest point on Cole's property, a small hill that overlooked his wheat fields and the distant mountains beyond. "Are you ready?" Cole asked. And Sirith nodded, even though ready was not quite the right word for what she was feeling. She activated the transmitter and spoke into it in her own language, identifying herself and providing codes that only the royal family knew. And then she gave the coordinates of New Montana and asked for rescue. The response came faster than either of them expected, a burst of encrypted data that made Sirith's translator struggle to keep up. And when she finally understood what it said, her 4-pupiled eyes filled with silver tears. "My mother is coming," she whispered. "She is bringing a fleet. She is coming to bring me home." Cole smiled and put his hand on her shoulder and told her he was happy for her. And he meant it, even though some small part of him was already mourning the loss of her company. But Sirith was looking at him with an expression he could not read. And when she spoke again, her voice was fierce and certain. "You are coming with me," she said. "You saved my life, and I will not leave you here alone. You will meet my mother, and she will honor you as a hero of the Empire." Cole started to argue because he was just a mechanic, and he did not belong in the courts of alien empresses. But Sirith silenced him with a look that reminded him very suddenly that she was royalty and accustomed to getting her way. "You do not have a choice," she said. And then she smiled to soften the command. "Please, Cole. I do not want to face this alone." And because she asked, and because she needed him, and because somewhere along the way, he had started to care about her more than he cared about his own comfort, Cole Bennett agreed to leave his home and travel to the heart of an alien empire. He had no idea what he was getting into, but that had never stopped him before. The Velkari homeworld was called Ithoria, and it was beautiful in ways that made Cole's eyes hurt and his brain struggle to process what he was seeing. For the planet had been shaped and cultivated over 10,000 years into a work of art that stretched from horizon to horizon. Cities of crystal spires rose into lavender skies, connected by bridges of living light that carried millions of citizens between districts that each held more people than all of humanity combined. And gardens the size of continents grew flowers that had been bred for beauty and meaning over countless generations. The imperial palace sat at the heart of the capital city like a crown upon a royal head, its towers reaching toward the stars from which the Valkyrie had once descended. And every surface was carved with the history of the empire in symbols and images that told stories older than human. Civilization Cole felt very small and very young as he walked through halls that had stood for millennia, surrounded by beings who had mastered technologies his species could barely imagine. And he understood for the first time why the galaxy called humanity a young race, but he refused to let his smallness make him feel inferior, because size and age were not the same as worth. And he had learned that lesson the hard way on battlefields where the biggest target was often the first to fall. Cirith walked beside him through the palace, pointing out landmarks and explaining history and traditions that he tried his best to remember. And she introduced him to servants and guards and minor nobles who looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. The news of her return had spread across the empire like wildfire, and with it came whispers about the human who had saved her life. Whispers that grew darker and more dangerous as they passed through the halls of power. Some called him a hero and a friend to the throne, while others called him a manipulator and a schemer who had somehow engineered the princess's rescue for his own gain. And still others simply called him an animal who should be put down before he contaminated their pure society. Cole ignored the whispers because he had dealt with worse in his military days. But Cirith grew more tense and angry with each passing day, and he worried that she would do something rash in his defense. The trouble came at the welcome banquet held in Cirith's honor, a grand celebration attended by thousands of nobles and dignitaries from across the empire. And Cole sat at a small table near the back because that was where they put guests who were honored but not important. He watched Cirith on the high dais beside her mother, dressed in gowns of shifting light and crowned with living crystals. And he thought she looked like a painting come to life. Beautiful and distant and somehow sad, the banquet proceeded according to ancient tradition, with speeches and toasts and performances that Cole could not understand but appreciated for their artistry. And he was starting to think the evening would pass without incident, when a voice cut through the music like a blade through flesh. I challenged the human. The hall fell silent, and every eye turned toward the speaker, a tall Valkyrie male with dark purple skin and golden eyes that burned with contempt and ambition. And Cole recognized the type immediately, because there were men like this in every species and every society throughout history. This was Lord Vareth, nephew to the Queen, and leader of the faction that opposed any contact with younger races. And he had waited for this moment with the patience of a predator stalking wounded prey. By the ancient laws of our people, Vareth continued, his voice carrying through the silent hall, any noble may test the worthiness of a foreign protector through ritual combat. This is tradition. This is law. This is the right of every citizen of the empire. Cirith rose from her seat with fury blazing in her four-pupiled eyes. But her mother's hand on her arm stopped her from speaking, and Queen Elith's voice was cold and measured when she addressed her nephew. You invoke the old laws against a guest of the throne, she said. That is your right, but understand what you are doing. Understand the precedent you are setting. Vareth smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I understand perfectly. My queen, I am ensuring that our traditions are respected, that our ways are preserved, that inferior beings do not corrupt our noble bloodlines through proximity to our princess. The insult was clear, and Cole felt his hands curl into fists beneath the table. But he forced himself to remain calm, because reacting in anger was exactly what Vareth wanted. If the human refuses the challenge, Vareth continued. He admits his unworthiness and must be exiled from our world. And the princess's protection will be revealed as meaningless sentiment rather than true strength. Cole understood now. This was not really about him at all. This was about undermining Cirith and embarrassing the queen and advancing whatever political agenda Vareth was pursuing. And he was simply a convenient tool to be used and discarded. He stood up from his table, and the movement drew every eye in the hall. And he walked toward the dais with the same steady stride he had used when walking toward enemy positions in wars that seemed very far away now. "What are the terms?" he asked, and his voice was calm and curious, as if he was asking about the weather. Vareth's smile widened because the human had taken the bait. "Bladed combat," he said. "To submission or death, no armor, no shields. Only skill against skill, will against will." Cole nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable, and then turned to the queen. "I accept the challenge," he said. "But I need to know the rules. I have never fought a Valkyrie before, and I do not want to accidentally cheat." There was a ripple of laughter through the hall, some of it mocking and some of it surprised, and Vareth's eyes narrowed at the implied insult. Cirith broke free from her mother's grip and rushed to Cole's side, her voice low and urgent. "You cannot do this," she said. "Vareth has trained in the blade for 400 years. He has never lost a formal challenge. He will kill you." Cole looked at her, at the fear in her eyes and the desperation in her voice, and he smiled the same smile he had given her on the first night when she was wounded and afraid. "Probably," he admitted. "But refusing means leaving, and I promised I would not leave you alone. So I guess I'm going to have to figure out how to beat a 400-year-old warrior with a few weeks of basic combat training and a lot of stubbornness." The duel was scheduled for the following morning, and Cole spent the night in his assigned quarters, studying everything he could find about Valkyrie fighting techniques and physical capabilities. They were faster than humans. That much was clear from the training videos he watched. Their reflexes operating at speeds that made human movements look slow and clumsy by comparison. They were stronger too, their muscles denser and more efficient, and their healing abilities meant they could absorb damage that would kill a human and keep fighting. But they had weaknesses, or at least differences. And Cole spent hours memorizing every detail, because details were often the difference between victory and death. Grand Arena was ancient, built in the early days of the Empire for exactly this kind of ritual combat. And it could hold 50,000 spectators in seats carved from living stone that had been grown rather than cut. Cole walked onto the sand wearing simple clothes and carrying a blade that Cirith had given him, a weapon that had belonged to the guard who had saved her life. And he felt the weight of that gift with every step. Vareth waited at the center of the arena, bare-chested and gleaming with oil, his blade moving through practice patterns too fast for Cole's eyes to follow. And he looked like a god of war come to punish a mortal fool. The queen presided over the duel from a high balcony, and Cirith sat beside her with her hands clenched so tight that silver blood seeped from her palms. And the entire empire seemed to hold its breath waiting for the slaughter to begin. The signal came, a tone like a struck bell, and Vareth moved. Cole had never seen anything move that fast outside of a spacecraft. A blur of purple skin and flashing steel that crossed the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. And the blade that should have opened his throat missed by inches because Cole had already moved. He had not tried to block or parry because that was impossible against someone this fast. He had simply moved backward and sideways, using the instincts that military training had burned into his muscles. And the look of surprise on Vareth's face was almost worth the terror clawing at Cole's heart. The first minute was a slaughter, but not the kind anyone expected. Vareth cut Cole 7 times, shallow wounds that bled red across the pale sand, and each cut drew cheers from the Lord's supporters in the crowd. But Cole kept moving, kept dodging, kept refusing to fall down and die like he was supposed to. His blood pooled beneath his feet, and his vision blurred around the edges. But he smiled through the pain, because pain was an old friend, and he had learned long ago that it could be ignored when necessary. Stand still and accept your death. Vareth snarled, frustrated by this prey that refused to behave properly. No, Cole replied, and he lashed out with his blade not at Vareth, but at the sand beneath their feet, throwing a cloud of grit into those golden eyes. It was not a noble move. It was not a traditional move. It was the kind of dirty trick that soldiers learned in the chaos of real combat. And it worked. Vareth recoiled, momentarily blinded, and Cole attacked with everything he had, trading wound for wound, because that was the only math. Cole woke up 3 days later in a medical bay that hummed with technologies he could not understand, surrounded by machines that monitored his healing body and administered treatments that would have seemed like magic to anyone from Earth. Sirith was there when he opened his eyes, sitting beside his bed in clothes that were wrinkled and stained, and her 4 pupiled eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and heavy with emotions she was struggling to contain. "You absolute fool," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "You could have died. You should have died. No human has ever survived injuries like those." Cole tried to smile, but his face hurt too much. So he settled for a weak shrug that sent pain radiating through his bandaged shoulders. "I told you," he managed to whisper. Too stubborn to die. The news of his victory had spread across the Empire faster than light itself could travel, carried by communication networks and gossip chains that connected 1,000 worlds. And the human who had defeated a Valkyrie noble in single combat became the most talked about being in known space. Some called him a monster, an animal whose savagery had overwhelmed civilized combat, and they demanded his execution for the insult he had dealt to their traditions and their pride. But others called him a hero, a symbol of everything the younger races could achieve if they were given the chance. And they saw in his stubborn refusal to surrender something that the ancient Valkyrie had forgotten over millennia of peace and stagnation. The conspiracy that had tried to kill Sirith used this chaos to make their move, believing that the turmoil would cover their tracks. But they underestimated how much attention the human had drawn to. The Imperial Court investigators who had been blocked for 3 years suddenly found doors opening. Witnesses who had been afraid to speak suddenly found courage. And evidence that had been hidden suddenly came to light because everyone was looking now. Everyone was paying attention. The threads of the conspiracy led higher than anyone had expected, reaching into the ancient houses and the sacred councils, touching nobles whose families had ruled since the founding of the Empire. And at the center of it all was Lord Vareth himself. He had not acted alone. That much was clear from the evidence, but he had been the primary architect of the assassination attempt, the one who had bribed the crew of the Celestial Dawn and sabotaged the engines and condemned hundreds of innocent people to death in the cold darkness between stars. His defeat at Cole's hands had broken something in him, some essential belief in his own superiority that had sustained him through centuries of plotting and scheming. And when the investigators came for him, he did not fight or flee. He took his own life in the traditional manner, a blade through the heart in his private chambers. And his final words were recorded by his personal systems and broadcast across the Empire. "We were supposed to rule forever," he said. "We were supposed to be eternal and unchanging. The humans will destroy everything we have built, not through war, but through their relentless insistence on growth and change. They will make us question ourselves. And questions are the death of certainty." Cole listened to these words from his hospital bed, and he thought about what they meant. And he felt something like pity for the ancient noble who had been so afraid of change that he had killed to prevent it. Other conspirators were arrested and tried before the Imperial Court, their fates decided by laws older than human civilization. And Cole was called to testify because he had seen things and heard things that no one else could report. He told the truth. The whole truth, exactly as he remembered it, with no embellishment and no exaggeration. And his simple honesty cut through the layers of courtly deception. Like a blade through silk, the nobles who listened to him speak were accustomed to hearing witnesses who crafted their words carefully, who shaded meanings and implied things they would not say directly. And they did not know what to make of this human who simply said what he knew and stopped talking when he ran out of facts. When the trials were over and the guilty had been sentenced, Queen Aleph summoned Cole to a private audience in the Palace of Eternal Stars, and they walked together through gardens that had been growing for 10,000 years. "You have changed, my daughter," she said as they passed beneath trees whose branches held flowers that sang in the evening breeze. "She argues with me now, questions traditions, demands reforms. She says humans taught her to see the universe differently." Cole was still weak from his injuries, walking slowly with the help of a cane that had been carved from wood grown on the first world the Volcari had ever colonized. And he considered his words carefully before speaking. "One human," he corrected gently, "and I did not teach her anything. I just treated her like a person instead of a princess." Aleph stopped walking and turned to face him, and her ancient eyes studied his face with an intensity that made him feel like he was being examined at the molecular level. "That is precisely what I mean," she said. "The Volcari have grown stagnant. We are so old that we have forgotten what it means to be young, to struggle, to fight against impossible odds simply because surrender is unthinkable." She began walking again, and Cole followed because stopping seemed rude. "My daughter has asked me to formalize relations with your species," she continued. "Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, military cooperation. She believes humanity has something to offer the galaxy that no ancient race can provide." Cole thought about this, about what humans could possibly offer beings who had mastered technologies beyond anything Earth had ever dreamed of. Beings who lived for centuries and ruled empires that spanned the stars. "What do you think we have to offer?" he asked. Aleph was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "Hope," she said. "You are brief, fragile creatures who build civilizations knowing you will never see them completed. You love knowing that you will die. You fight knowing that you cannot win, and somehow, impossibly, you find joy in the struggle itself." Cole thought about his wheat field back on New Montana, about the crops he had planted, knowing he would never see them reach their full potential, about the house he had built, knowing that someday it would crumble to dust. "We do not have a choice," he said finally. "Being miserable does not make the struggle any easier." "No," Aleph agreed, "but you choose joy anyway. That is what makes you remarkable." The treaty between the Volcari Empire and the United Human Colonies was signed 6 months later in a ceremony that was broadcast across 1,000 worlds. The first equal partnership between an ancient race and an emerging species in galactic history. Historians would argue for centuries about its significance, about the political and economic forces that had made it possible, about the long-term implications for both species and for the galaxy as a whole. But those who had been there knew the truth. The simple truth that complicated minds often overlooked it. It happened because a mechanic from a backwater farming world had found a wounded stranger in his wheat field and had decided to help her. Not because of who she was, but because helping was simply the right thing to do. Cyrith returned to New Montana once a year after that. Every year, for as long as Cole lived, and she brought dignitaries sometimes. Ambassadors and scholars and curious nobles who wanted to see where the Great Alliance had begun. They expected monuments. They expected museums. They expected grand memorials to the events that had changed galactic history. Instead, they found a small farmhouse in the middle of a wheat field, with a human man sitting on the porch drinking coffee and talking to his machines as if they could answer back. This is where it started, Cirith would tell them. Watching Cole work on some piece of broken equipment with hands that were still calloused despite decades of invitations to live in luxury on Ethoria. This is where everything changed, and Cole would look up and smile and offer his visitors coffee. Because that was simply who he was, and who he had always been, a man who helped because helping was right, who fought because fighting was necessary, who loved because love was the only thing that made sense in a universe that often seemed senseless. The Valkyrie lived for centuries, and the humans lived for decades. And the mathematics of that difference should have made their partnership impossible, but mathematics had never understood stubbornness. And stubbornness was what humans did best, so they built something together. These ancient beings and these brief, bright creatures. Something that neither could have built alone. And the galaxy was better for it, and it all began with a crash in a wheat field. And a man who asked a wounded stranger if she needed water. That was the story they told for generations. The story of how everything changed, not with wars or invasions or great speeches from powerful leaders, but with a simple act of kindness from a simple man who never understood why everyone made such a fuss about doing what was obviously right. The end.